All right, well, welcome to Springfield Amazon Web Services Group. Today we're going to talk about identity and access management on AWS. I'm Jason Klein with Logic Forte, and our company has been using AWS for several years. We moved our platform that manages information for restaurants over to AWS in about 2015, 2016. Depending on exactly when you consider moving. I mean, we started at some point and then quickly realized that that was going to be a big win for us, so it didn't take us long to move everything over. But we've worked with AWS for quite a while, and this group is meant to cover a lot of the basics that people need to know to get involved in AWS. So if you are new to AWS and wanting to figure out from a software developer point of view how to start using AWS and benefiting from AWS, hopefully today's intro to Iamb will give you some insight into how to more properly secure your environment. With that, we're going to dig into some Iamb concepts. Here's sort of the agenda for today. We're going to talk about the Iamb dashboard and the security status check marks that you see on the front page. By the end of today, hopefully all of those will be green on your dashboard, if they aren't already. We're also going to talk about groups and users and roles, and when you would use each of those. And then we'll dig into policies. We'll talk a little bit about AWS built-in policies, and then we'll talk about building our own policies, and I'll demonstrate that using the visual builder. And then if we have time, we're going to jump out of Iamb and look at security groups and ACLs in VPC, just because with this being security oriented, that's a good thing for you to be aware of. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. So let's dig in. I'm going to jump back and forth between the slides and the AWS console. We have a console that we use for our user group, as you can see here. All right, making sure that looks okay on the screen. All right, good deal. So I'm going to log in. I'm logged in. Ooh, that's our work console. It's not the one we want. Here we go. So I'm logged into the AWS console, typing Iamb to jump to the Iamb dashboard. And now this is a demo account, and we've already completed some of these steps, but I'm still going to walk through each of them. I've purposely either undone or not completed certain steps for this demo. First, the first step, activating MFA on your root account. As we go through each of these, I'm going to expand on them, and so that will probably cause us to be able to skip over users and groups and such as we get to them a little further into the presentation. But terminology-wise, I feel like the biggest struggle that people have when they're first getting into AWS is the number of assumptions made in the documentation. I mean, they just assume that you're up to speed on what a root user is, or what MFA is, or different things like that. So I'm going to expand on that so that then when you're following along and deep diving into Iamb later for specific projects or tasks, you at least know what you're looking at and what they're talking about. So the root account, when you first create an AWS account, that is the email address and password that you log into AWS with. You can assign an API key to that account, the access ID, the long string, but I highly recommend not ever using that in production or even in testing, because there isn't a real good way to lock down access on that key. So let's say I can give you a practical example. When I first started using AWS years and years ago, long before we were using it at work, I wanted to use AWS to back up data with some cloud backup software. Their tutorial walked me through setting up an AWS account and then generating the API key pair and then plugging that into their software. Little did I know that I was giving their software full access to my entire account. Now, it was a reputable company. I doubt there'd be any funny business on their end, but what happens if their database is hacked and someone gets a hold of those keys? They have free access to a ton of AWS accounts because that company has told them to generate a key pair that gives them full access to an AWS account. And you would notice that pretty quickly when Amazon shoots you an email and tells you that the warning that you're up to about $1,000 or whatever your monthly bill is when you've probably been trucking along at 50 cents or $1. I mean, that'll be a big red flag. So, and they can sometimes work with you if there's a hack issue like that, and they can tell that it's not typical behavior, but I mean, why go down that path and have to even mess with it? The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to activate multi-factor authentication on our root account, but then as we go through here, we're also going to create individual IAM users that we log into the console with and that we generate key pairs for so that we can give those users specific access to our account.
You can also do the MFA on the users.
Correct, correct. But the comment was we can also activate MFA on the users, and right now we're going through the IAM dashboard and just making sure all of these items are green. So normally you would click the Manage MFA button, and that is not working. Does anyone happen to know where to go to turn on MFA? Since that button is not working. Otherwise, we can come back to that, or I'll post it in the group after the fact. I couldn't hear you, sorry. I am not. Okay. So the comment was, are you logged into your root account? You can only activate MFA on your root account if you're logged into your root account. So let's do that. And that's why I ask the audience.
And so every user that activates also has to log in. You can't do that from the console. Every user has to log in and activate MFA as the user.
Okay. So we're going to log in as the root user. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. All right, let's try this again. IAM, activate MFA on your root account. Manage, we'll click Manage MFA, and then we have the option to use a virtual multi-factor device or a hardware multi-factor device. In our case, we'll use something like a Google Authenticator, or you can even use something like your password manager, and it's giving you instructions and telling you you need to install a compatible application, and then it gives you this QR code. So if you have an application like a Google Authenticator, you would add a new account, you would scan the QR code, and then it will show you on your device the 6-digit multi-factor code. You would type in the first code, you would wait for it to rotate, you would type in the second code. If you don't, if you're using something like a password manager, for example, let's say we want to turn on MFA for this, and we're going to track the code in 1Password, you could go in and add a one-time password field and paste that. And you could paste your long MFA code, and now you'll see that there. Paste that in, and then when it rotates, you can paste the other one in, and you'll be good to go. How many folks here use multi-factor on other applications? Okay, so everyone's familiar with the process. Good deal. Well, if it gives you trouble or you have questions, let me know. We're going to activate that. We're good to go.
So one more, so that MFA was not
that's believable. The comment was that the current stat is that MFA can eliminate 95% of most hacks. Totally believable, because as long as you're not doing what I just did and storing the multi-factor code alongside your password, probably in good shape.
95% of account hijacks.
Okay. So another thing that you need to do, if you haven't done so already, is delete your root access keys. We're going to go into security credentials. I went through that pretty quickly here. I clicked on delete root access keys. I clicked manage security credentials, and now it's showing me a prompt asking, are you sure you want to go to the security credentials page? We really recommend that you use the Iamb tool. In this particular case, we have to go to the security credentials page to access this setting, and then you can see that there are no access keys here. If there was one, you could delete it, because we're going to walk through how you'll set up those access keys on a per user basis. Much like how I was logged into the dashboard as an Iamb user and had to back out to log into the root account. I mean, that's an example of I just never log into that account. Once you're up and running, you set up a sub account and log into that. At least that's the best practice. Now, as far as creating individual Iamb users, let's go ahead and walk through that process. We've already done that, and you'll see that we have a little bit of a naming convention here. But since this is the SGF AWS account, we've prefixed my login and Bryce login with SGF AWS dash, and you can use whatever naming convention you'd like. These names don't have to be globally unique like S3 buckets do, so you can use shorthand. It just helps me keep my sanity since we manage a couple of different accounts. But let's add John Doe. I like lowercase, so I'm trying to force it. And we're going to go ahead and give John Doe an API key, and we're going to give John Doe console access. All right. And now it's asking us which group we would like to give John Doe rights to. You can, it defaults to that because the recommendation is that you set up a group and attach your policies, and you attach your any type of, any policies to that group, rather than attaching them directly to a user, because inevitably another user is going to need similar permissions, and it's not as easy to clone the permissions over, and then all of a sudden you have two users with directly attached permissions and policies, and if you're needing to change things, they get out of sync pretty quickly. It just becomes a headache. So in our case, we're going to create a group, and we're going to call this group staff. And now it's asking us which policies the group should have access to. In our case, let's give John S3 access. Right now we can see built-in policies. We're going to search for S3, and we only want him to be able to read from S3 for now. So we'll choose the Amazon S3 read-only access. That'll allow John to list buckets and list the contents of buckets and download items from buckets, but he can't change buckets or create buckets or add files to buckets. And then at that point, that's all that he's going to be able to do. We'll review, and then finally we'll create the user. Now it's giving us one opportunity to download the access key and the secret key, and I'm going to keep that in a scratch pad during the session here, but but this is going to get wiped out afterwards, so I'm not too worried about people being able to see it. All right, and then at that point, we could also send John an email with login instructions for the console, but we're going to skip over that. Now the nice thing is, if you decide that Jane also needs access to the same things, but only needs console access, you can go through the same steps, and then you can choose the staff group, and now John and Jane both have access to the same information. All right. So we've created some individual AWS users. As long as one or more users show up in the user tab, that'll turn green. Now we want to use groups to assign permissions. We just talked a little bit about that. We have groups in our account, so that is also green. You'll see Bryce and I have an admin group that we're both members of, and then John and Jane are both members of staff. Now, the last check mark is an Iam Password Policy. We don't want people to set passwords like password or beefcake or anything super simple, so we're going to require at least one uppercase letter and one number. We will allow them to change their own password. You could potentially even enable a password expiration or prevent password reuse. I mean, during password audits, in my experience, people are terrible about using January 1/8, February 1/8. I'm like, I don't know that preventing password reuse fixes the problem. That's more of a user education issue, but it is an option. We'll also set the minimum password length to 8, and we'll apply our policy. Now at this point, we do have an Iam Password Policy. And Amazon lists those 5 items because they feel that they're important enough to call out right on the front page, which is why we're talking about them first. Let's flip over to our slides here somewhere. All right. Any questions about those concepts before we move on to groups, users, and roles? If not, we talked a little bit about groups. There's really not a lot to say. I mean, users are members of groups, and groups have policies attached to them. So when we look at this user page, we can see which users are members. We can see when we click on the permissions page which policies are attached. We'll go down the list here. Users, you already saw a little bit, when we create users, they can have either API access or console access or both. I'm going to fire up another browser and log in as Jane just to see what that looks like. When you log in, you have to use a special Iam sign-in link, which shows up right on your dashboard. Iam user sign-in link. So do be aware of that. That can be a frustrating pain point for people that are getting started, because they'll go to the normal AWS login page and can't figure out how to log in with the new user. That first number is your account number, and then the username, Jane Doe, and the password. It's asking me to save the password, but we're not going to do that. Jane has S3 access, so if we go into Iam, her access is going to be somewhat limited. You're going to see errors because it can't look up a lot of the different things here. Literally, you can't even see Jane's user account because she doesn't have permissions to see that. But let's jump over to S3. She has full read access to S3, so you should be able to see a few buckets, and then if you go into this deploy bucket, you'll see last month's zip file, and we can even click and download to that file. Yes, and that's a bad example because the bucket is public, but even if the bucket were private, we would be allowed to download the file. All right, but if Jane goes to any other areas of the console, her access is going to be very limited. Literally all she can access at this point is S3. Now let's try to access, let's try to access the S3 buckets from the command line with the API keys. So I'm jumping around here. Let me go back to our admin login. Now, I just created an EC2 instance today. I'm going to walk through what that looks like so that you are on the same page, but since I already have one up and running, we won't have to wait for it to launch. We covered instances a few months ago, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but we're going to launch an instance, and I'm going to accept mostly defaults here. Amazon Linux released version 2, so we're going to use that. We're going to take the defaults otherwise. So we're going to review and launch. I do need to change the security group so that we can SSH into the instance. If we create a group and accept this page, it would add a rule that allows SSH on port 22 from anywhere. But since I've already done that, I'm not going to clutter up my security groups. I'm going to choose the SSH from any that I already created. We'll review and launch. Looks good. Use the key pair that is already on file. If you don't have a key pair here, you would go into EC2, go to the key pair menu, and you'd upload your SSH key pair. And then at this point, it's working on adding that instance. But you can see that we already have another instance on file. So we're going to SSH into that one. EC2-user at the IP address. So anytime you're connecting to an Amazon AMI, you'll use the default user EC2-user. All right. It's telling us about package updates. I'm not going to worry about that right now, but it is good to keep those up to date. All right. Let's see if John can access S3. So the nice thing about Amazon Linux AMI, it has the AWS CLI built in. So S3 unable to locate credentials. Let's run AWS configure and plug in those credentials for John. AWS access key, AWS secret key. You can see those are just the two items that they gave us. I'm going to accept defaults here because we're in the default region, but if you were in another region, you might have to type US-E-1 or US-E-2, etc. Now let's try to list buckets again. All right, now we can see the two buckets that Jane could see through the console. It's really that simple, and that's how the keys work. And now that person doesn't even need console access. When you create that account, a lot of times we'll create accounts that only have API access. Very normal. We'll have user accounts, like I have an account that I use to log in to the console, but I have a separate account that I use to manage access through the API. So, I mean, it really comes down to what you're comfortable with, but I'm just sharing that that's pretty normal configuration. And then if we want to list the contents of the bucket, of course, we could type the bucket name and we'll see that file. Now, we're going to jump into roles. How many people have used AWS roles? Okay, a couple. Good, 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 good. So that's why I want to cover this. It's very, very helpful. And the idea behind roles is that you don't have to embed your AWS API keys into your applications or into your tooling. I mean, whenever we're pushing code to, whenever we're building out our code that uses AWS, whenever possible, we try to use roles. And I'll demonstrate that here in just a second. But the idea is that if you're running your code on an instance, whether that be EC2 or ECS or Lambda or whatever, in the Amazon ecosystem, we can tell Amazon anytime this server or this container or this function is running, it has these permissions. And so let me demonstrate that here. We're going to remove that. We're going to remove our AWS configuration from this server. the file that contains the credentials we just configured. So now when we run another S3 LS, it's going to complain that we don't have any credentials. All right. So now, why don't we we're going to jump over to EC2. And we're going to go to instances, and I'm going to check to see if this instance has a role, and it does not. You can look right here, it shows Iamb role. So let's create a role. I'm going to jump back to the Iam console. I'm going to go to roles, and now it shows a few different roles that we had from prior meetings. We're going to create a role. Since we're working with EC2, we're going to create a service role. We're going to tell it the role is for EC2, but if it were for Lambda, you would tell it as such. If it were for containers, you would choose Elastic Container Service down here. Anyway, EC2, next. And now we're going to attach a policy to the role. So think of the role sort of like groups. And then think of your servers and your containers and your functions as users. All right, so there are some parallels there. So essentially this role or server group will have S3 read-only access, just like we had given John and Jane in the staff group. We'll call this SGF AWS app, because let's pretend that we're building out an app and we're giving maybe our front-end servers access to S3. All right, the role has been created. I'm going to jump back over to EC2, right-click on the server or the instance, attach the role, and then it'll show a list. You can search. We only have the one, so we'll apply, close. It only takes a few seconds for it to activate. And now I haven't changed anything. I haven't gone into the server and plugged in any credentials at all, but it's able to list those containers again. And then we can see inside or not containers, the buckets. And then we can see inside the bucket as well. And we could even get to the file if we wanted to. And it's not get, it's CP. And there it is. So that's an intro to roles. Any questions about those? Because they're super, super helpful in getting keys out of your code. If you think of anything after the fact, hit me up here or on Slack. Now let's jump into Iamb policies. So at this point, we're able to create groups or roles and then users or assign the roles to our resources. But the built-in policies only go so far. Let's look at the built-in policies. Iamb policies, like I said, just going down the list here. They have default policies for every service, and they generally have a read-only and a full access. They sometimes have mid-level access depending on the exact service, but as you can see, I'm scrolling through here and they've got policies for just about everything. The downside to this is that the policies are an all or nothing. So think about an S3 bucket with maybe multiple folders. You might have a folder that you might want people to be able to read the entire bucket, but only be able to write to a certain folder in the bucket or a certain prefix in the bucket. And if you're using the built-in AWS policies, you could give them read access or you could give them full write access, but there's not an in-between. So let's prep a bucket, and then let's create a policy that gives them the ability to read the entire bucket, but only write to, say, a public prefix. So I'm going to jump over to S3. We already have a couple of buckets here, but we're going to create a new one. We'll call it app. Now I mentioned that the root user has access to everything in AWS. The exception to that rule is if you go into individual resources like S3, some of the resources will allow you to set ACLs that do allow you to restrict access across the board, even to your own admin user. So if you are ever struggling to get access to some resource with an Iam user, and then you jump up to your root user to try and gain access, and you're still not able to access something, look at the resource, look at its settings, and try to figure out if there's some sort of ACL that's set that's blocking access for everyone. We're not going to get real fancy here. We talked about S3 in detail a few months ago. This is the permission page I was referring to. As of right now, the root user or the owner has read-write access to the objects and to view the object permissions. If I were to uncheck those or delete that line, I would have created the bucket, but I can't manage anything in it, even as the root user.
This doesn't restrict people trying to access it, though, and you will get
Correct.
charged for that. We're getting upwards of 1 million plus requests to access our buckets a month.
The comment is even setting these type of rules will not prevent people from trying to access your buckets, and there is a fee for bucket reads, even if they're attempted reads. So don't use a generic bucket example. Like we talked about S3 in detail, so I'm going to breeze over this, but if the S3 buckets, when you name them, they have to be globally unique. And if you go and type in a name like Springfield or example or app, and it's available, you're going to start to see those fees because somebody somewhere has probably set up some demo that's pointed to that and just keeps trying to hit it, and even though they don't have permission, they're racking up reads. So that's a great point. Sort of an aside here, but we're not going to change our permissions right here. We just want to create the bucket because we're going to manage permissions in Iam. And then let's go ahead and add a file to the bucket. We'll upload iTerm. Whew, I expected more. Come on, SpringNet. All right. So now everybody should be able to read that, but when everything's said and done, people will only be able to upload files to a public subfolder. All right. So let's create our policy. We're going to use the visual editor. First off, you choose your service. We're going to choose S3. And then you tell it what you'd like to be able to do. We're going to use Amazon's default policy and attach it to a group and say they can always read everything. So we'll leave that as is for now. But we're going to create a policy that allows us to write to a certain folder. And to keep things simple, I'm going to choose all write options. We're going to choose the resource type. It's asking for a bucket ARN. An ARN is their resource name, so it's ready for us to type the bucket name. We'll type SGF AWS app. If we wanted to set up this policy for all of our buckets, we could click any and it would put an asterisk there. And I'm going through the visual editor because they've done an amazing job with it. They've put a lot of time and thought into it. Every once in a while, you have to get into the JSON code behind the scenes and make edits. Sometimes it is a little bit easier to do that with more complicated policies, but for the most part, kudos to Amazon on this visual editor. So we're allowing the bucket, and then we could allow any object, but we're only going to allow public. And we don't need that extra. All right. So now anything under the public prefix will, that's not right. What am I doing wrong here? Okay, there we go. And we can set up other conditions as well. If we wanted to require that the person have MFA access, we could do so. With S3 as the example, let's say you have versioning turned on, and every single time a file is edited, the old version is saved and the new version shows up for everyone. A lot of people will require MFA to delete old versions. It's a pretty common thing. That way somebody doesn't hack your account and go in and delete all of your files, which creates a delete pointer for all of the files, but the old file's still there. And then they go in and they wipe out all of the versions, meaning you really lost your data. Bad deal. You can also lock down to a source IP. You can add other conditions. They have things, just all kinds of options here. Afterwards, if you want to see specific examples of something, I can do a walkthrough with you. Let's see. We'll review the policy. AWS app. Public right. And the naming convention is just a personal preference on my end. I see a lot of people use camel case versus snake case versus the hyphenated deal. I always prefix things with the whatever project or login, just so that when I'm looking at code, I know exactly which Amazon account it's in. All right, so we've created that policy. Let's give it a try. We're going to go to groups. We're going to give staff access to that policy. Now we'll try to upload something to a public folder, and the downside to live demos might not work. All right. So we're going to upload that Dynamo demo. Oh, come on. Autocomplete's not working, so we're going to upload that and see if it takes. It did not. Let's double check our policy. I believe I named that right. You might be right. No, that's good. The comment was you probably need a wildcard at the end. So let's go back in here, edit the policy. Like that. And I don't think that we want that. I'm going to change our actions and filter this down to just the ones that I know that we need, because it is complaining about the type of resource. So certainly if we're going to upload something, we need put access, put object. Just to be safe, I'm clicking all of these puts, but I don't think that we need most of them. The main one is put object. All right. Let's give that another try. Well, trust me, it works, right? Isn't that what Oh wait, I know what we did wrong. So we gave John and Jane access to that rule, but this is operating under a role. So we also need to attach that to the role. So it was probably fine, but that's okay. It does take a couple seconds to kick in, but let's give it a try. And there it is. All right. Like I said, it takes a couple seconds to kick in, so I knew to not freak out. But now we can look and we can see the file in public, but let's try to upload the same file to the root folder. And that should give us an error. All right. So there you go. What else do we have? Obviously that slide is not complete, but let's talk about policy evaluation. There's a first step, a second step, and a third step. There's also a great resource on exactly how this works. So I'm going to refer you to that resource, and I'll link this in the Slack channel since we're running short on time. That is the one. The document is titled Iam Policy Evaluation Logic, and it goes into details, the basics, how organizations affect the logic, the request content. Some of the interesting points here are that, number one, policies aren't evaluated in a specific order. So you don't have to worry about, well, does this policy get evaluated before that policy? They're evaluated in such a way that by default, it's assumed that access is denied. If you allow in access broadly, but then you deny access in some specific way, then access is taken away. So you could have something like, I can write to the entire bucket, but I can't write to this prefix. So maybe you have a bucket that has all of your front-end graphics, but then for whatever reason you're putting your logs in that same bucket. You could even go so far as to say you can read this entire bucket, but you can't even read the logs prefix. And this goes into greater detail there. And if you have specific things you're trying to accomplish, hit me up in Slack and I'll work with you and we can see if we can knock out a policy, or I can send you an example of a working policy. Because it can be a little bit tricky to get started with this, but once you've seen a couple even basic policies, I think you'd become pretty comfortable with it. Let's see. Yeah, Miranda, question? So you can create a policy on a bucket itself, right? You can. It's not recommended, but it can be done. What would happen, like, does this guide talk about what happens? This does go into that. In that particular case, I'm almost certain that the policy on the bucket takes precedent. So if you have conflicting policies and your bucket says something is denied, regardless of how much access you're giving the user through policies, they still can't access it. This does address that, though. That's a great question. So how would you, like, shut off access to your... Well, that's okay. Well, hit me up afterwards, and we'll talk about it. I do, since we do have a couple minutes left, I do want to just briefly touch on VPC security groups and VPC ACLs. Since this is fairly security focused, it's something that I want everyone to be aware of. We're going to jump over to VPC in the console, and I'm going to point out where to find these items. So you can manage security groups through the EC2 console or through the VPC console. You're going to see this SSH from any over here. In general, most people manage those from the EC2 side, but then you can only access the ACLs from the VPC side. And with this being a fairly basic account, you're not going to see any rules here. It's going to allow everything. I was trying to find There we go. So you can see by default the VPC allows all traffic, and then it denies all traffic. That's more for demonstration than anything, because you could narrow down this first rule and you could say only allow from a certain IP or certain range, and then, or only allow certain ports, and then deny the rest. This is, there are differing opinions on this. In my opinion, the ACLs are great for locking down source and destination addresses. It gets a little bit tricky when you get into the protocols, because my understanding is that the ACLs are not connection aware. So in the olden days of firewalls, if you were to allow port 22 into your server, you also had to allow the return traffic on certain ports. And I'm almost certain the VPCs require that. So be aware of that. If you're allowing certain ports in, very likely you're going to have to allow a wide range of ports out so that the return traffic can go out. So if you do set this up or experiment with this and you're allowing certain protocols and for some reason it's not working, that's something to look for. But on the security group side, we probably go overboard with security groups, but we will literally set up different security groups for each, essentially security groups that coincide with the roles that we were talking about in IAM. So we'll group servers in such a way that, like our front-end web servers that are all behind a load balancer, all of them need access to the same resources. All of them are needing to be available on the same ports. So they might have some sort of app role where they can access S3 or RDS or whatever they're needing to access, but then they'll also be in a security group that, and we'll walk through this, but a security group that allows port 80 and port 443 in. So let's call this web from any. And we'll allow HTTP and HTTPS from any. And since we're not hosting on IPv6, I'm going to take out the v6 version of the any. There really isn't, we didn't talk about pricing today. There really isn't pricing tied to any of this. All of this is basic infrastructure that's provided when you pay for the other Amazon services. So when I'm cleaning those things out, it's more for my own sanity. It cleans up lists that I see later, but we're allowing that, and then by default, it's allowing all traffic out. I mean, we'll go so far as to only allow like a custom TCP rule, port 8080 to our to our proxy or proxy cluster, and then anytime we're running software updates, it will go out through that Squid server and then onto the internet. So all of those outbound requests are logged. And so our servers are very limited on what can go in and out. And it just, like I said, it provides additional logging. In the old days, we used to do that more for performance reasons, but we kept it around because of the security benefit. So on the inbound, in this particular case, if this were a real application of ours, we would be allowing HTTP only, and we would be allowing that from our load balancer IP addresses or our load balancer range. Because SSL or TLS terminates on the load balancer, and then regardless of what type of traffic comes into the load balancer, it's always sending 80 internally. Some people will always have it send 443 internally, but the point is you wouldn't need to open both ports. And it wants a description. We have sort of a naming convention we use, and that's not it. I'm just trying to be quick. If you have questions about security groups, definitely let me know afterwards. I can even show you examples of some of the things we're doing. We have some sort of crazy scripts that we use that allow us to only allow traffic from AWS IPs by essentially downloading the AWS IP list and building out our own security group list. It's ugly, but it works. So if that's something you're interested in, ping me, and I'd be glad to share it as well. And with that, any other Q&A? I mean, we're at 1 o'clock, so I want to get you guys out of here. And if you do think of anything, you're welcome to stick around. Be sure to take care of your wait staff, and hopefully they can get us out of here pretty quickly. But thanks again for